Sanity with your podcast host Keegan, and this is your podcast for all mental health, addiction, recovery issues, and topics. And today we have a very special guest, especially if you've had any questions about dopamine. She's the author of Dopamine Mountain, and her name is Andy West. How are you doing today?
I'm really good, and thanks again for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being on the show. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, real quick?
It's a long story, but in a nutshell, I had to write this book to pull myself out of the biggest rut of my life,
Mm,
which all kind of happened around the COVID era, the long COVID. Also, a
mm-hmm,
bad trip was thrown into the mix. So I kind of had this
mm,
implosion of my life going on, relationship problems, lockdowns, lack of work. And so I
uh-huh,
kind of just had everything collapse, or almost everything. Thank goodness, I still had a home to live in, and
mm-hmm,
I still have a lot to be grateful for. But it seems that my whole brain and body shut down, and I wasn't able to do things I could do before. I couldn't really access what turns out to be my dopamine reward system.
mm-hmm,
Um, and for years, I struggled with the symptoms of ADHD, although I wasn't actually diagnosed, but
mm,
executive dysfunction, time blindness, no
mm-hmm,
motivation. I struggled to get out of bed a lot of days.
mm,
I had anhedonia, which is, if
mm,
people don't know, it's kind of like depression, except you don't necessarily have poor self-worth or poor self-esteem, because I've been
mm-hmm,
there and I know what that feels like.
uh-huh,
This was kind of like a chemical lack of dopamine, which is our motivation, mood, and drive. So for
mm,
some reason, my body just could not access that.
mm-hmm,
And I tried all these supplements. I tried doctors, blood tests, MRIs, fasting, and a lot of them helped, like a little bit, like a tiny bit, but I couldn't
mm-hmm,
really figure out how to put it together to really get my life back on track. And I was
mm,
absolutely desperate for something to work.
uh-huh,
Um, and when something did work, I thought, okay, well, I better write a book about it. But going back a little bit, in
okay,
my early days, my teen and early 20s, I was extremely depressed. I was
mm,
suicidal. I was using amphetamines.
mm,
Also, I was using MDMA and a little bit of psychedelics here and there, a bit of weed
mm-hmm,
here and there.
mm-hmm,
And I was actually quite addicted to the amphetamines.
mm,
And that was also a really kind of low point in my life. But also, I
mm-hmm,
was getting a benefit from it because drugs do
mm,
raise your dopamine. So
yeah,
I was using and abusing them.
mm-hmm,
So yeah, then sort of come full circle, and I can talk about how I got over that if you want, like how the drugs sort of left my life.
sure,
Um,
yeah. I mean,
it was a
it's all part of this all-encompassing story, right? So,
Yeah, yeah. So I guess it is kind of important to my story because I had messed up my dopamine reward system pretty badly, but it
mm,
actually did recover. And the way I
oh,
was just lucky enough to not be using amphetamines anymore was that the drug supply dried up. And
oh,
of course, I was not happy about that at the time. But what
yeah,
was happening is I was using these drugs
mm-hmm,
and I wasn't getting high. And it was
mm,
basically like I was still wanting them, but
mm,
nothing was happening. So what also happened was that meant that I tapered down my dose
mm,
accidentally,
huh,
and it just tapered down naturally. Well, I wouldn't
mm-hmm,
say really naturally, but because the supply was just getting cut and cut by people, so
mm-hmm,
you were using it, but nothing was happening.
yeah,
Um, so even though I was still wanting it, it was, in hindsight, what was probably happening is my dopamine was dropping every time I thought about it because I would want it. And
mm,
then I'd think, oh, it's not going to do anything, and
mm-hmm,
I'd take it. Oh, it's not doing anything. So that
mm,
dopamine drop, it turns out, is one way to interrupt addiction.
huh,
So I've since learned that when we think about our addiction or our vice or whatever it is that we can't really control,
mm-hmm,
we want it because we want the dopamine that it provides. And
yeah,
so dopamine gives us mood and motivation and
mm-hmm,
just a feel good experience, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm wanting my drug of choice, every time I think about that, I actually get a little spike of dopamine just from the thought of it.
Hmm.
And whenever we get a little spike of dopamine, that means we repeat the thought.
Mm-hmm.
So I want spike, I want spike, and then it just keeps amplifying itself. And that's how addiction begins. So
Huh.
it's not necessarily the use, like obviously it starts with the use of the drug, because as soon as we
Mm-hmm.
use whatever that substance might be, we get a very novel and brand new experience of dopamine that we haven't really had before. And novelty is massive as the dopamine release.
Mm.
Um, so, what we can actually do to interrupt that, and there's interesting studies done on this,
Mm-hmm.
when we think the thought, instead of letting our brain have that spike in dopamine, which it
Mm-hmm.
naturally does for us, we
Yeah.
can lower our dopamine deliberately. And we can do that by something challenging, difficult. I shouldn't say painful, because people get
Mm-hmm.
a little bit worried when you start talking about pain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe for some reason, for some people, I should say, that is a problem. But we do
Mm-hmm.
something hard, challenging, unpleasant.
Mm-hmm.
So the brain thinks addictive thought, and then you interrupt that with a low drop in dopamine. Addictive thought, low drop in dopamine. And when we
Uh-huh.
have a drop in dopamine, we don't repeat the experience because it's not a reward.
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out, like if we have a puppy
Mm-hmm.
or a pet that we're trying to train, when it does the thing we want it to repeat, we raise its dopamine with a snack or
Uh-huh.
with praise or
Mm-hmm.
something, you know. And so that's even how humans are trained,
Yeah.
as babies, whether right or wrong, but we are kind of trained, and we
Mm-hmm.
are given our dopamine rewards when we do the thing that somebody else wants us to repeat, or
Mm-hmm.
even we want to repeat. So, yeah,
Yeah.
we can actually use our own dopamine spikes to make us repeat behavior that we choose to repeat, instead
Hmm.
of it kind of just being random spikes in dopamine all day that we're
Mm-hmm.
chasing all over the place, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
Very
yeah.
interesting.
So I might, yeah. So the study that I reference in the book
Mm-hmm.
was about people who are addicted to cocaine. And the
Huh.
study found that when these people crave their drug, just
Mm-hmm.
mentally, when they are induced to crave the drug with paraphernalia,
Mm-hmm.
as we probably all know, when we see the paraphernalia of the drug, we start wanting the drug.
Mm-hmm.
They actually released more dopamine, these people addicted to cocaine, in the
Uh-huh.
lab than when they were injected with actual cocaine. So it
Wow.
shows that our wanting is not the
Mm-hmm.
same as our liking. And there's
Huh.
a number of studies that show that dopamine is wanting,
Mm-hmm.
but liking is actually controlled mostly by a different neurotransmitter called GABA. So there's wanting from dopamine
Mm-hmm.
and liking from GABA. And then
Gotcha.
those two feed back into themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes a feedback loop. But if we can interrupt the
Mm.
liking,
Mm-hmm.
and to give ourselves something we don't like. For example, I will use chili sauce sometimes. If I'm having a repetitive thought that I don't want to repeat, I
Uh-huh.
would do squats or push ups or sit ups, or just something that makes me feel like I don't want to do that again, something unpleasant, because I don't love exercise. I just do it because it works. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is actually one way to interrupt addictive thoughts, to do something unpleasant straight away as soon as the
Mm-hmm.
thought occurs. And it
Okay.
it takes a number of repetitions. It wouldn't just happen on the first go. Like
Mm-hmm.
anything, the brain needs repetitions to learn a new pattern.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was an interesting finding.
Okay. So how does someone go about and interrupt that thought? Because the thought is really quick in the head. So you've got to
Yep.
be pretty quick on your feet to interrupt it, right?
Yeah. So what I do, and people don't have to follow this advice. This is not medical advice, and I'm not a doctor, but I actually pinch my skin.
Oh.
Um, and because it just causes a quick little hit of pain. Now, that
Uh-huh.
has never led to me wanting to self harm. It's
Mm-hmm.
never led to me wanting to do it again because I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and interestingly, with self harm, there are also studies that show a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people who are self harming are
Mm-hmm.
not doing it to because they hate themselves, although,
Yeah.
people vary.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but a causing of pain to ourselves lowers our dopamine, and so then it is able to rise again. Dopamine can
Oh.
only feel good when it's actively rising.
Uh-huh.
So the drop in dopamine from the pain
Mhm.
This is like not after an addictive thought, but this is just in general. After
Uh-huh.
pain, dopamine will rise from just relief itself.
Huh. Okay, that
Mm,
makes a lot of sense. Because I actually suffered from self-harming, and that would make sense because it was a way to get uh, emotions out that otherwise couldn't
uh-huh.
find an expression, if you will. And so,
Right.
and it also does make sense that the longing is a little bit stronger than the liking whenever it comes to that regard, because who wants to actively hurt themselves in any kind of way, and how does that actually work? So it's really interesting that they actually feed back on themselves, the dopamine and the GABA. So
Mm.
addiction though is a negative feedback loop, so dopamine and GABA is a positive feedback loop, right?
I haven't really heard it put that way before. I'm not really sure. But yeah, no, seems to make sense. So with the self-harm, which I also went through, well, not a lot of self-harm, but I did go through depression.
Mm-hmm.
And what can happen is our dopamine can get really, really stuck, and so it's
Hmm.
not able to actively rise. And so people
Okay.
don't realize that if you want to rise, you got to push it down first. And this is
Hmm.
one of the reasons why exercise can
Mm-hmm.
be helpful for people with depression. Although it's the last thing we want to do when we feel like crap. We don't want
Yeah.
to go for a run. We
Uh-huh.
want to do absolutely nothing. So,
Mm-hmm.
ironically, if we want to feel better, we have to feel worse first. And that can be where pain comes into it, because relief after
Uh-huh.
pain ends is rewarding. It does
Mm-hmm.
activate the dopamine reward system.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one analogy that I like is that dopamine can be thought of like a helium balloon.
Hmm.
But if we've had too many dopamine stacks in a row, for
Uh-huh.
example, the drug, the coffee, the sugar, the scrolling, the porn, whatever it might happen to be that is our vice,
Mm-hmm.
well, we only have so many dopamine receptors, and dopamine will
Mm-hmm.
not rise within a certain time frame. It just can't go up anymore unless we went and get a really strong hit of something very novel, like a really novel drug or something.
Huh.
And for most people, we don't want to recommend that, of course, but that would be
Yeah.
the only way dopamine would have a rise, when we've stacked all these dopamine raising activities without anything to drop it
Hmm.
in the meantime. So
Uh-huh.
if we think of our dopamine like a helium balloon that is stuck at the ceiling, that's
Mm-hmm.
just stagnating there, and that becomes our new low. So that becomes our new
Oh.
normal. So the only way to get a rise in dopamine is to push or pull the dopamine balloon down,
Mm-hmm.
and then it may rise again. And that is where challenge, effort, workouts, cold plunge, all of these things come into play, because they actually, from unpleasantness itself, is
Mm-hmm.
how we can lower our dopamine by choice, and
Mm-hmm.
then it's able to rise just from relief. Um,
Hmm.
and if we would like to supercharge dopamine, we
Uh-huh.
can push the dopamine down by choice, effort, challenge, etc. And then afterwards, immediately afterwards, have our dopamine reward of whatever it might be. So I'm talking about safe things in moderation here.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone were quitting cigarettes, they might say, well, I'm allowed to have one cigarette after I do my workout. And that way it can moderate intake. And the
Uh-huh.
cigarette feels better when we don't
Uh-huh.
just have 20 in a row, like it feels better when we've worked for it, because
Uh-huh.
there's a disparity between the low dopamine state of the workout and the
Mm-hmm.
much higher dopamine state of the cigarette. And so, what I use personally is sugar. So, I do not use
Okay.
sugar in my day except for when I'm using it as a dopamine reward for
Hmm.
hard work, effort, that sort of thing.
Uh-huh.
And then it spikes my dopamine, and it acts like a drug of abuse in the brain. And the interesting thing is, when I started experimenting with this, I would have
Uh-huh.
like one candy,
Uh-huh.
sometimes two if it was something like really strenuous. But I'd choose in
Mm-hmm.
advance, okay, well, I want to get this task done. All right, you can have a candy once you do the task. And
Yeah.
this morning I did this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it turns out when I started doing this, I no longer crave sugar. I used to crave sugar all the time, but now
Uh-huh.
I know that yes, I can have my sugar. I haven't said a hard no, like I haven't put restraint on myself. And interestingly, constraint and restraint lowers our dopamine. We want to break out of that and we want
Huh.
autonomy, and
Yeah.
autonomy gives us dopamine. So, of course, if we
Huh.
say, well, for some people, I mean, everyone's different, but if
Yeah.
I personally say, you can't have the thing, I
Mhm.
want it more. I
Yeah.
just go like, well, yeah, I'm going to get it anyway. Like I just like, I want to rebel against the rules because
Yeah.
rebellion gives us dopamine and that's what we're all
Mhm.
looking for,
Ah.
if we're in addiction or a low dopamine state. So
Mhm.
yeah, I just use my little rewards to get
Mhm.
things done. And then it's a good way of moderating my reward because I get things done now and I get a reward and I don't crave them anymore because I associate the sugar with the hard work.
Mm.
So the
Okay.
faster and more instantaneous the dopamine occurs, the more
Mhm.
addictive it is. And we can
Mm.
see this with injection versus smoking versus snorting different substances. Sorry if this is
Mhm.
triggering to anyone. But the quicker it hits, the more that we want it and the more it
Mhm.
is addictive. So if
Mhm.
anyone's having addictive thoughts, maybe experiment with some way of doing a squat straight away. That's something that most of us, if we're able bodied and
Mhm.
privileged enough to be able to do, we can do a squat straight away or a push
Hmm.
up or hand weight or something like that if we have one handy. So, yeah, just
Uh-huh.
interrupt it and see what happens.
Okay. And then
Hmm.
what does someone need to do after they interrupt it? Because then if it's interrupted, they are either going to go right back to that thought or maybe be distracted enough to follow another train, right?
Yeah. So
So,
they uh, if they go back to that thought,
mhm.
interrupt again.
Okay.
If they go back to that thought, interrupt again. I don't care how boring it is, it's definitely worth it. And speaking of boredom,
Uh-huh.
boredom is just a low dopamine state. And
Okay.
anyone who cannot handle boredom, and I
Mhm.
mean, that's most of us these days because we have so many instantaneous ways to be entertained and to get,
Mhm.
our dopamine.
Yep.
But anyone who can't handle boredom is just that they can't handle low dopamine. So we can
Hmm.
deliberately get comfortable in boredom. We can
Uh-huh.
teach ourselves to embrace boredom, and
Mhm.
that's something that meditation has helped me to do. And so now, when I experience that feeling of boredom, I actually try and like breathe it in and feel it and be relaxed and actually make the most of that boredom instead
Mhm.
of it being something that makes me want to go seek something, and get some quick hit
Mm.
from somewhere.
Gotcha. So, whenever someone is sitting there and they have successfully interrupted the thought, what do you suggest to them to help avoid the longing in the first place, if that's such a huge dopamine spike?
Well, the longing itself needs to be interrupted. And
Mm-hmm.
then when you've got that little break of that, yes, I feel like I successfully interrupted,
Mm-hmm.
maybe have something on hand that you
Mm-hmm.
want to actually do because
Okay.
you'll feel success from that.
Uh-huh.
So we all have chores that we need and want to do around the place just because
Mm-hmm.
they come up every single day, like cleaning or packing things away or making the bed or whatever.
Uh-huh.
So, what I would personally do, and I do, is choose a chore, go and do it, and then have a reward. And we know
Okay.
what our rewards are because it's our vices. And for me,
Uh-huh.
it's sugar, coffee, and a snack these
Mm-hmm.
days because I know how to use specific vices that are safe or
Uh-huh.
safe enough that I can use them in moderation. So get something done and then reward yourself because it's actually a really successful way to go about our day. Little steps,
Mm-hmm.
people always tell us if you want to break down a large, difficult task into
Mm-hmm.
smaller steps, that will help us achieve it. But they don't
Mm-hmm.
tell us to reward each step. If we
Ooh.
reward every step along the way, that
Uh-huh.
spurs us on with a little bit of dopamine to go to the
Mm-hmm.
next step. And I do this all the time. So even
Mm-hmm.
if someone can't get out of bed, just move one hand closer to the edge and have
Mm-hmm.
some kind of reward. And I'm talking about a mental reward because we need to
Mm-hmm.
remember that that is successful. That is not a failure. I'm telling
Yeah.
you right now, if you moved one hand closer to the side of the bed and that was a challenge for you, that is a success. Now do it again, and keep going
Mm-hmm.
because we forget that movement is success.
Yeah.
We should never judge our success against someone else. It's
Mm-hmm.
all about how we would like what we would like to do in our day, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Yeah, and I think that you bring up a really good point on movement is success because anything that's alive is going to be moving of some sorts. And
Yeah.
I mean, success in life is just life itself, right? Because otherwise you have death. And so if you're awake, then you should maybe be a little bit grateful. But at the same time, don't diminish your own aptitude for being able to move and breathe because that's just like you said, for some people that can be enough of the day is just surviving. So
Yep.
with someone that is in deep depression, their new level is at a super low dopamine. How do you suggest someone push their dopamine down to get it back up? Because if they're already
Yep.
depressed, it's pretty low, right?
Yeah. And what it can actually be is high masquerading as low. So it's just flatlined, basically.
Oh,
Um,
okay,
Probably more helpful to think of it as flatlined
okay.
because, and when we are in depression or anhedonia or in the lowest mood, of
Mm-hmm.
course, we don't want to do anything.
Yeah.
And the brain has actually started deleting its circuits of movement and action because it's found quicker ways to get its dopamine. That's
Huh.
how plastic, like neuroplasticity, works.
Uh-huh.
Um, so we don't realize that the circuits for actually initiating movement are gone. We got to learn them again. And that's what I
Whoa.
had to do. And it's extremely hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It was the
Yeah.
hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life.
Huh.
But I had to remember that every motion is a success. Every day you have survived until now is a
Mm-hmm.
success. And so take one movement, reward yourself mentally, go again. It's going to be the hardest thing you ever do, but I can guarantee you it will work. It just
Mm-hmm.
takes repetitions, like building a muscle. It
Mm-hmm.
just takes repetitions. And
Huh.
remember that every single time we take action, instead of just doom scrolling and bed rotting, every single time we take action, we grow new synapses in the brain. The
Mm-hmm.
brain actually gets larger, and this has been proven by a number of studies,
Oh
and
wow.
we learn success all over again.
Hmm.
So even if you didn't fail the last time, you just gathered some more information and then you start again. It doesn't matter how many times you feel like you failed, you didn't. You
Mm-hmm.
just change tact and do it a different way and
Hmm.
keep going. And that's called growth mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Carol Dweck popularized the term growth mindset.
Okay.
So instead of seeing things as a crappy challenge and feeling like a victim of circumstance, which we've probably all been there,
Mm-hmm.
turn that around, use the stress, use the challenge and the struggle,
Mm-hmm.
and grow the brain one step at a time. And
Mm.
just remember that every time I challenge myself by choice, I'm
Mm-hmm.
getting stronger and better. And it's true, we are. And that's how I got out of it.
Oh
And if
wow.
I was like absolutely useless,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't say that to put myself down, but I couldn't do anything. You
Yeah.
know, I could barely even
Mm-hmm.
string a sentence together or have a cohesive thought. Like I was down to my last brain cell. So
Mm.
if I can do that and then learn about dopamine, and hopefully inspire other people to do it too, then
Mm-hmm.
anyone can. And they're going to help someone from what they learned. Like their
Mm-hmm.
wisdom is going to help someone else the same way that you're helping people with what you have experienced. You know, that's what we're here
Mm-hmm.
for, I think.
Yeah. And that's really powerful. And I think that it is amazing that you were able to pull yourself out of that. And it is super what is the right word I'm looking for? It's beyond honorable, but it's along the same lines. It's just super awesome that
I'm just grateful for it, really.
yeah.
You know, and so I should also say that the reason that I had these ideas, a number of podcasters and things all sort of came into my life at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the way that I structured my protocols was to do the hardest thing first thing in the morning. And of
Mm.
course, you don't want to get out of bed and do a hard thing first thing in the morning. But
Mm-mm.
basically, as soon as I could see daylight, I
Mm-hmm.
would get up and go do my run. Now, it started out as a walk because I had
Mm-hmm.
fatigue as well. So I would
Yeah.
just get out and walk. And then I would try and make it the hardest thing of my day. And it sure was, you
Mm-hmm.
know. But
Yeah.
eventually that hard thing got harder and harder because I got stronger and fitter doing it.
Mhm.
So I every day I get up and I do what is now my run, but it started out
Mhm.
as a walk. Do whatever
Mhm.
you can, crawl if you have to, but just do something hard. And if that's the hardest thing in the day, logically, the next thing will be easier. That's how dopamine works,
Ah.
because we strengthen ourselves by the hard things. And then the
Mhm.
next thing means a dopamine rise. It is
Ah.
definitely going to rise if you push it down.
Mhm.
So that's kind of how I got the book written. So doing the hardest thing first was an idea from Brian Tracy, who wrote
Mhm.
a book called Eat That Frog.
Okay.
Um, and then I also started doing a protocol by Stephen Pressfield. Um, the War of Art was the book that he wrote that I
Mhm.
read. And so he talks about time blocking, where you get up, you put aside a certain time,
Mhm.
and you just write. And I
Hmm.
wasn't planning to really be a writer. So I was
Uh-huh.
journaling to start with.
Mhm.
But I could tell that this protocol was working. So I thought I better just at least write down this protocol because it
Mhm.
just started to work and I could think again. Like I could organize,
Oh, wow.
like I could be a normal person and I had more than one brain cell to rub together. And I started to become myself again, which was amazing because
Mhm.
I thought I had permanent brain damage and memory loss as well.
Mm.
So um, yeah, so I just basically would sit there and force myself to write for 2 hours on a timer, and it
Oh,
turns out
boy.
that forcing myself to focus made me good at focus. Like anything, that's how plastic our brain is. If we struggle to do something, do it
Mhm.
more, and that's how we conquer it. So,
Hmm.
yeah, so all these protocols are sort of put in the right order, which I was quite grateful to find them.
Mhm.
Because in the morning we do have a little bit of natural dopamine that we get from sleep.
Huh.
So if we supercharge that and do a really hard thing first and then
Mhm.
some kind of reward, we can then just bounce into the next thing.
Oh, wow. Okay, so is there a way to help supercharge dopamine for the morning? Since we start with a nice little bit of dopamine in the morning, is there a way to maybe push it down right before bed so that whenever you wake up, you get a little bit more of a boost?
Oh, that's interesting to push it down before bed. I haven't really done that myself. I try to, at night, I dim the lights a bit and try and get a little bit more of the relaxation going
Mhm.
into my evening. I do a little bit of yoga. I do about 5 minutes of yoga before bed because
Mhm.
personally, I tend to get vertigo if I don't do that.
Oh, wow.
So, when I started doing that, I noticed I don't get vertigo anymore. So I just like to do that just to
Huh.
keep that away. But it also, meditation, yoga, deep
Mhm.
breathing, om chanting, that sort of thing have been shown to enhance GABA. And
Mhm.
GABA is also a molecule of relaxation and rest,
Okay.
as well as enjoyment. So I think enhancing GABA at nighttime is probably the more important thing to do.
Okay.
Now, I wouldn't really recommend that people take a supplement for GABA because
Mhm.
when we take a supplement or an outside source of dopamine, that
Mhm.
means the body doesn't have to work for its dopamine. So it
Mm.
just doesn't make any. And that's how we got ourselves into addiction in the first place.
Mm.
So we were supplementing what would naturally be our dopamine reward with
Mhm.
fake dopamine. It could be porn, scrolling, sugar, etc.
Mhm.
Um, so, although sometimes people need that to boost themselves out of a rut, like sometimes medication will do that, I would
Uh-huh.
highly recommend try the natural way first of pressing your dopamine down and
Mhm.
then rewarding your effort.
Mhm.
And yeah, even sort of balance the two things to
Mhm.
try and take us forward in a new way.
Okay. And so how can someone increase GABA on their own? If it's likened to liking something, we definitely want to like certain things a little bit more than what we may have whenever we were in depression. So, how does someone increase GABA for something?
So, ironically, we do things we don't like. So,
Mhm.
when our liking goes down,
Mhm.
it's the same sort of principle as a baseline situation with dopamine, then
Huh.
GABA can go up. And some medications that actually lower our GABA
Mhm.
um, and then let it rise naturally have been used in depression. For example,
Hmm.
ketamine therapy is one.
Oh, wow.
Um, GABA is also really closely linked to empathy. So
Mm-hmm.
I think now I'm not sure on this, but I assume that MDMA has probably something to do with the GABA receptor as well for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if people have used that, it does enhance your empathy for yourself and others, or at least that's my experience. People
Mm-hmm.
experience things differently.
Yep.
But I don't recommend using the drug. So the natural ways of doing this are relaxation,
Okay.
deep, slow breathing,
Mm-hmm.
yoga and meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so they will om chanting as well. And like
Mm-hmm.
people, if they haven't tried om chanting, it doesn't have to be a religious thing, although it can be for some people.
Mm-hmm.
What it does is activate the vagus nerve, so that helps get us out of the fight or flight. And
Mm-hmm.
so you basically just say the word om
Mm-hmm.
in one sort of monotone, just pick a tone, om.
And you just
And
hold it.
so that actually, yeah, that vibration in the
Mm-hmm.
body,
Mm-hmm.
if we sit and just do that for a few minutes and relax into it, I personally do this all the time when I just need a few minutes to myself. My
Uh-huh.
dogs are used to it now, it doesn't even bother them. Although I'm surprised they don't just chime in with their own kind of howls or something, but, yeah, like the other thing that, GABA is related to, and this
Mm-hmm.
is super interesting to me,
Okay.
um, GABA is also our nerve feedback. So it's
Oh.
what transmits, or it's one of the things that transmits nervous feedback from the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we touch a surface,
Okay.
be it furry or spiky or cold,
Uh-huh.
though GABA is one of the ways that transmit the nerve signals back to the brain.
Hmm.
So we could think of dopamine as the outgoing and motor cortex
Mm-hmm.
movement of electricity,
Uh-huh.
and then the incoming is more of the GABA. So when we feel things and we use our senses. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's another reason that mindfulness and
Mm-hmm.
being grounded and connecting to our senses
Mm-hmm.
makes us feel relaxed, because it activates GABA. So
Huh.
one thing that people could do is to
Mm-hmm.
feel, if they can, try and feel the electricity which is actually there in our fingertips or our
Mm-hmm.
toes. I learnt this from Eckhart Tolle. I really like his books.
Nice.
Um, and we don't realize that that feeling is there. And we're
Mm-hmm.
blocking out all of these sensations. Like I'm blocking out most of the time the feeling of like my butt on the chair or
Mm-hmm.
the shirt on my back, or just
Mm-hmm.
the feeling in my eyebrows, for example. Like we have all these nerves and we're not using them.
Mm-hmm.
So when we ground ourselves in nature or something like that, we listen to each sound, the birds, the cars, the fans, whatever it might be, and actually reconnect with our surroundings. And
Mm-hmm.
all of those nerve inputs are using GABA. So if we
Huh.
want to strengthen that, we need to use it. That's what it's there for.
Okay.
So different tastes, different smells, actually
Mm-hmm.
go into the fridge or pantry and smell different things, different herbs, different foods, like actually take it all in,
Uh-huh.
because use it or lose it. So
Mm-hmm.
some people who struggle with anhedonia, because on Reddit I'm sort of reading a few different people's experience, because I was in and I'm still in the groups for anhedonia on there.
Uh-huh.
Some people will put their different objects, just random objects, in a bag and practice feeling to identify each one.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of the time when we're struggling with our mind, our
Mm-hmm.
senses go offline a little bit as well. So it's
Yeah.
just one way to practice using those.
Huh.
So give ourselves challenges. Go
Uh-huh.
and use those senses. Smell different perfumes or essential oils, or even things that are enjoyable. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll come back online.
That's really interesting. I had no idea that the GABA was involved with all of that, and it sounds way more powerful than uh, I would have ever even first thought. And it does make me wonder if GABA is also somewhat akin to mindfulness or awareness. Because as you were talking about that, I was doing a mental checklist on those same sensations and stuff, and I was like, okay, so I'm getting a feel for my body, and whenever I do that or I ground myself, I can actually get goosebumps, and
Mm.
it kind of makes me wonder, like, is that my body releasing GABA saying like, "Hey, you're fine. You like being in this seat doing what you're doing," or is it something else? I don't know. But
Yeah, that's interesting. I sometimes get goosebumps when some truth or realization hits me, like
mhm.
something really true and
Mhm.
yeah, you know those things that sort of jolt you and go, "Wow, that's so true." I get goosebumps then
Mhm.
sometimes, and
Yeah.
also sometimes when I listen to music, but the
Mm.
vocalists,
Yeah.
more so the vocalists, people who
Mhm.
have amazing control over their body,
Uh-huh.
over their vocal cords. Yeah, what
Mhm.
else gives you goosebumps? Do you have other one? Can you do it on your own? Can you induce them?
Yeah, like I was kind of doing it earlier. Like right now, my legs have the goosebumps. And
Mm,
so I don't know if I can make it travel up. Let me see. Hmm. See, like I'm tingly, but it's
mm,
not so much like goosebumpy at the moment. I think it's kind of in that cycle of like I have to push it back down and kind of ignore those senses for a little bit because
mhm,
it's something that like as I've been going through my day after starting the podcast and stuff, talking to a whole bunch of people, it's been interesting to sit there and be mindful in my head. And see, now
mm,
I'm getting chills like going back down my spine thinking about it. Um,
mm.
so I
That's
don't.
the power of the mind. Like you just used your mind to affect your physiology, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Yeah.
You just yeah, so that there is a lot of power in our mind. Like you just affected your skin surface
Mm-hmm.
just by thoughts.
Which is weird. So, you're saying that our thoughts can actually do a whole lot more for us than we're really giving ourselves credit for, huh?
Oh, amazingly, because dopamine tends to be the window between mental and
Mm-hmm.
physical. You know, we need it to
Mm.
physically move. We
Mm-hmm.
absolutely need it for every single physical movement, but
Mm-hmm.
also it's one of the main key molecules in almost every mental health problem as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's right there in the middle of the action.
Huh.
And another way, if people think that their mind can't control their body, or at least the power of the mind, we can
Mm-hmm.
just have a sexual thought and our body responds, you
Yeah.
know.
Uh-huh.
Just as one example of how much influence our mental uh, state has on our body. That's an instantaneous thing, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's eh, our mind has so much power.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think about how many mental health problems, if only we had our dopamine in check,
Mm-hmm.
think about all the addiction problems that our dopamine can sort out.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, obesity is an addiction to food or sugar or overeating.
Mm-hmm.
And and so many of our health problems stem from diabetes and obesity.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine if people just learned to put their dopamine in check, they would
Mm-hmm.
sort out almost all of these problems, as well as
Mm-hmm.
procrastination and motivation and getting things done and, you know,
Mm-hmm.
working towards their dreams and that kind of thing. So it's a really powerful molecule.
Oh yeah, it's amazing, and I wish I had known a lot of this before, especially while I was in active addiction. Because whenever you were talking about the dopamine being the longing and the GABA being the liking, it did make me think back to whenever I was in active addiction to alcohol. I would sit there and I would have the terrible cravings. I'd be jonesing for any kind of alcohol, and the thing was if I went to the liquor store and I bought it and it was in my hand, the cravings were gone. My body was
Yeah,
instantly
wow.
like, yeah, it was like, okay, we got it, so we can relax now. And
Yeah,
my body at the time was actually rejecting alcohol. It was
yeah,
saying that, hey, we want it and we need it, but we don't actually like it anymore. So I would
yeah,
actually either have to force myself to hold down the first shot or I would puke it out and then it'd be okay to go. But it was
yeah.
very interesting that the simple purchase or having it in my hand would eliminate the cravings. Um,
Mm.
so,
Do you remember a time when alcohol was your safe place? Because it might be that just you rewired your brain for
mhm.
it to be a substitute for safety.
And see, that's kind of the thing too, is that I don't know if it ever really was a safe place for me, but it was the thing that understood me without judgment. And that
Mm,
was the thing that I was really crying out for, was to be understood, to be heard, and to just be accepted, in a sense.
mm.
And uh, alcohol, I mean, in a sense, it did provide that in the social settings, but whenever the social setting was done, that was the only thing I had left to carry over
Yeah.
the good feeling. So,
And so did alcohol make you judge yourself less as well?
um, well, alcohol was one of those weird things because I had a love-hate relationship with it. I would judge myself extremely harshly after I would drink. It
Mm.
was
What about during though?
daring. Yeah, I would judge myself extremely harshly. It
Oh,
was, uh, it would help alleviate the immediate emotional onset of whatever it was. And then about an hour or so after consumption of the alcohol, the negative feelings and thoughts would start coming back in of, oh, I shouldn't have done that, I screwed up, oh, I know how to fix that emotional mishap, and that would be
yeah.
take more. And so it was just a really vicious cycle. And then every now and then it would make me feel okay and acceptable until it started to not. And then the only way
Yeah.
to make myself feel decent again was to bring it back up. So it was either I felt normal or I felt worse and worse, and the only way to make myself feel somewhat better was to have some more, just to make
Mm,
myself feel bad again.
mm.
So,
So it might have been that when you were feeling low,
mm-hmm,
because dopamine was low, because
mm-hmm,
that's how it works, then you wanted to find something that would raise that, and
mm-hmm,
that's the easiest and quickest thing, at
yep,
least to the perspective of your nervous system. That
mm-hmm,
was what it thought. Well, that will solve my problem of low mood.
mm-hmm,
But then we're less able to raise our dopamine internally that way. And then when
mm-hmm.
it drops even more, when we don't have our substance, what are we going to turn to? The substance, which just, like you
Yep.
said, a negative loop. Yeah.
And it was, I knew how to solve problems, and then whenever it started creating more problems, I knew how to solve problems. I just didn't have enough of that substance, um, and
Okay.
and it just never really worked out well. And that was one of the things too, is that there were other substances involved with alcohol and stuff, but alcohol was the one that was socially acceptable. It was legal, and so, like you said, my brain went, "Oh, that was the easiest, quickest, fastest solution to solving all my problems." But it
Mm,
didn't. It didn't really do anything except for make everything exponentially worse. So,
yeah. Because each time you're less able to handle that yourself because the
mm-hmm,
body outsources that dopamine somewhere else.
mm-hmm,
And also, problem solving is intricately tied to dopamine as well. We need
really,
dopamine to problem solve. Yeah, because that is work, that is
uh,
mental work.
huh,
Yeah. So it's our motivation both mentally and physically. And
hmm,
one thing that gaming, people who are addicted to gaming find,
uh-huh,
they can solve problems in their head and in the game, but not in real life, because in the game it's so instant. All our
uh-huh,
rewards are so instant, and the flashing lights and the other people's praise and all this
mm-hmm,
kind of thing. And the brain overwrites those circuits because
mm,
instead of having to go out and do things in the real world, it can just
mm-hmm,
do it in the head and in the game. And
mm-hmm.
so the brain just goes, well, this is how we get our dopamine now. And that's all it does. It just forgets
Huh.
everything else. So we've got to learn it again.
That's so interesting because I I actually had a little moment in my head earlier today that I was sitting there thinking, like, I'm forgetting how the real world works sometimes, because, like, if I place this object here whenever I meant to put it here, I don't have a system telling me, oh, you messed up and it's supposed to be over here, or I don't have instant feedback of decisions, and it's not that I'm addicted to gaming, it's that I've been really heavily diving into it because it was one of those hobbies that I lost in addiction. And so it was like, hey, we're going to pick this back up, and it helps, but it definitely has to be in moderation. And
Yeah, if we use it as our reward, whole
mhm.
different thing because it
Yeah.
moderates it for us. So if
Mhm.
you wanted to do all your hard stuff first thing in the morning, like doing all your podcast prep or your research or whatever you do, and then say,
Mhm.
well, I'll have 10 minutes of gaming, that way
Mhm.
you get everything done, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just remember to stop and then do a bit of a rest and then go again.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I'll have to definitely implement that. And I think it's really interesting that you were talking about how the circuits related to movement in the brain can actually get deleted. So
Yep.
that would also make sense with someone that's getting everything through moving just their fingers instead of having to get their whole physical body up to go do the dishes, for instance.
Yeah, that's right. And I should probably mention that
Mm-hmm.
we all evolved, and animals as well. The whole animal kingdom
Mm-hmm.
evolved based on effort, reward, rest in that order. And it has
Ah.
to be in that order because when our ancestors woke up in the morning,
Mm-hmm.
they couldn't just go to the refrigerator and go to YouTube or Netflix, or
Uh-huh.
Pornhub or whatever. If
Uh-huh.
they wanted and needed, it's actually about need. If they needed
Mm-hmm.
sustenance, they had to go and hunt it or gather it, or farm it or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there had to be effort. And then the reward is the food
Mm-hmm.
because we feel better after having something to eat. And that
Mm-hmm.
spurs us on with energy to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
But well, actually, after we eat, first we need to rest and digest, depending on how
Yeah.
much we've eaten. So that's where rest comes in. So
Hmm.
even as a small child, if we wanted something on the other side of the room, we had to
Mm-hmm.
crawl to get it.
Yeah.
We had to apply effort, and we were
Mm-hmm.
rewarded by picking up the toy or
Mm-hmm.
going to the other child we wanted to go over to. So all of our life, we have had to do effort, reward, rest. Even in
Mm-hmm.
school, we had to sit down and do our work for those of us who actually did anything in school, because a lot of the time I didn't do anything in school. But we do our work and then we're rewarded with our snack and our lunchtime and things like that. So it was
Mm-hmm.
structured for us. And then we
Mm.
wonder why can't I motivate and structure myself when I'm an adult because I
Yeah.
don't have a teacher there saying it's time for biology, and it's time
Uh-huh.
for lunch now because
Mm-hmm.
we forget that we are wired for effort, reward, rest.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting.
Just
And
just keep cycling through them. And if we forget the reward, we
mm-hmm.
get burnout. So if we just do
Yeah.
work, work, work all the time and we don't stop when we're feeling overexerted and have the reward,
Mm-hmm.
that is burnout. So,
Mm.
moderating these things of effort and reward, it
Mm-hmm.
it plays into so much of our life.
Yeah, it really does sound like it. And with the advent of all this super awesome technology that we have and transportation, we don't really have a whole lot of effort in our lives nowadays, right?
Right.
So, how do you think that all of this is going to be affecting the human evolution in terms of dopamine and GABA and rest, e- effort, reward, rest, right?
Honestly, it's killing us. It's killing
Mm,
children. We're
mm-hmm,
addicted to screens, sugar,
mm-hmm,
social media. And this is, in my opinion, why
mm-hmm,
our mental health is so bad,
mm-hmm,
why our physical health is so bad. Because, like you said, we don't have to put in a lot of physical exertion anymore. We're going to have to
mm-hmm,
do this for ourselves.
mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's going to kill us all.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think the first analogy that kind of comes to my head about it is it's similar to how we have to go to the gym to stay in physical shape whenever back in the day, all we had to do was just live, right?
Yeah. And it's called recreation for a reason because we're recreating stuff that we had to do. That's what recreation means, you know.
Huh.
So we're making these fake ways of giving ourselves effort,
Mm-hmm.
and honestly, that effort is the only thing keeping us alive. Pleasure
Mm.
is nothing without its opposite of like
Mm-hmm.
discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
Without the discomfort, it turns nothingness and numbness,
Mm.
Um, so we have to have that balance of the light
Mm-hmm.
and the dark if we want to survive as people.
Yeah. And so how do you think and I don't know if I'm going to use this right, but like someone that is a hedonist, someone that gets nothing but pleasure from life and everything like that. How do you think that it would work for them? Because we can't really stay in a state of bliss and pleasure 100% of the time, right?
Yeah, it collapses into chaos and numbness and pain. Yeah, it
Mm-hmm.
will. So you've got to balance that out with challenge if you want to
Mm-hmm.
keep experience any pleasure.
Gotcha. So essentially, it's all about moderation. We definitely want to make sure that we reward our efforts and we rest after that. And then it's a cycle, but what do you suggest to do in between the rest and efforts phase?
Um, well, I mean, what else is there? So
Yeah, exactly.
so effort is just stuff we need to do,
Mm-hmm.
and reward is stuff we like to do, whatever
Mm-hmm.
it is, our play, our recreation, our free time,
Mm-hmm.
and then rest. So, and reward is like our food as well. So
Mm-hmm.
before we have a meal or a snack, it's always a good idea to do something effortful first, like do a chore first, because then
Mm.
when we have that reward, it's going to reinforce the doing. So everything that we
Okay.
reward, we get better and more interested in doing the hard work for one, and then the
Mm-hmm.
reward feels better than if we hadn't done any work, like because of the relative rise in dopamine. So
Mm-hmm.
we could pretty much structure anything we want to get done in
Mm-hmm.
that way.
Okay.
Like whether it be our dreams and our goals, we wake up and we write, or we write a film script, or we
Mm-hmm.
podcast, or whatever that thing might be for people, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and then that way, if they get that out of the way and it's the hardest thing, then have a reward and then just go on with your day. So it's just a restructuring, really,
Mm.
of things we kind of wanted and needed to do anyway. And so
Uh-huh.
my morning routine, I take a cold shower
Mm-hmm.
after my run, and
Mm-hmm.
then I have a coffee. My coffee is my reward.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it doesn't waste any time in my day because I was going to do that anyway. It
Uh-huh.
just restructures it.
Okay, and it definitely sounds like you restructure it in your head, especially because it's not just I'm going to take a shower after I take a run. It's I'm going to put a little bit of work into the day, and this is what I'm going to enjoy because I did that. It's not
Yes,
just
that's right.
if you don't put that intention there, your body or your brain may not recognize that, oh, hey, this was meant for this reason, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I do that.
Mm hmm.
I think, "Okay, I did my hard work, now I'm going to have my reward." So I remind myself that,
Mm
"Yes, I just earned this. I deserve this reward because I
hmm.
caused it to happen."
Uh
So,
huh.
yeah, I do feel like I feel like that's important to remember to successfully reward ourselves for things, because every movement is success, and they say that mood follows action. And
Ooh,
that's
yeah.
because when we use action, we're
Mm-hmm.
actually lowering our dopamine to do the hard thing. And so that's why we get a mood enhancement afterwards.
Ah, so that's kind of interesting. So dopamine is depleted through physical uh, exertion, and then GABA is essentially letting the body know, like, hey, this is what the dopamine just did, and then
Yep,
the GABA's sitting there going, like, oh, we liked that, so here you go. Okay,
exactly.
huh?
So the GABA is what decides whether
Mm-hmm.
it was successful or not. So
Ah.
just say we want to climb a tree and get a fruit,
Mm-hmm.
and we climb and we fall out of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
Pain, and GABA goes unsuccessful because we now
Mm-hmm.
feel worse than what we did. So did the
Ah.
dopamine go up or down? And so GABA is like the decider.
Mm.
Um, so then we might decide it's not worth, there might be so much pain, which is
Mm-hmm.
glutamate, this whole other neurotransmitter. There might be
Mm.
too much glutamate and it goes, not worth it. We're not going to try it again. But if there's not too much pain and we can
Huh.
still see that nice bright fruit up there and we think we can do it differently this
Mm-hmm.
time, then dopamine drives us to get it. And once we get it and feel
Mm-hmm.
successful and even eat it, then that's GABA saying
Okay.
we like it. Mm.
So whenever someone gets knocked out of the proverbial saddle, it's not necessarily them wanting to get up or not. It's their brain going, "Hey, that hurt a whole bunch, and it's not worth it."
Mm.
So,
Yeah, so there's like a pro and con system in the brain. So
mm-hmm,
dopamine is the pro
mm-hmm,
and glutamate is the con. So if we have
mm,
too much glutamate, which is
mm-hmm,
pain, fatigue, and it does a lot of other things in the brain, but mostly what you would call a negative thing. If there's
mm-hmm,
too much of that, we don't move forward. But
Hmm.
unfortunately, we can have too much glutamate from things like trauma,
Mm-hmm.
abuse, because it can build up and not be released. So, unreleased
Huh.
emotions actually trap it in the body the same way that pain traps it in the body as well.
Oh,
So,
wow.
that's another reason to go towards our difficult emotions and tackle
Mm-hmm.
that hard stuff, because when we go towards it and
Mm-hmm.
and don't just push it out of the way with our mind or with substances, when
Mm-hmm.
we go towards it, we're activating dopamine, because dopamine is our forward moving chemical,
Ah.
whereas glutamate is activated by fight or flight.
Uh-huh.
And so it's our fear chemical. So we're
Hmm.
either motivated by what we
Uh-huh.
want, which is dopamine, or what
Mm-hmm.
we're running away from and afraid of, which is glutamate. So they're both excitatory neurotransmitters. They both give us
Mm-hmm.
energy.
Uh-huh.
And GABA is the rest in between each one, whether we liked it or we didn't like it.
Huh. Interesting. So dopamine does have an uh uh alter ego of sorts.
It's arch nemesis. Yeah.
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 um and so does dopamine actively go against glutamate at the same time? Uh
Not really at the same time, except in schizophrenia, it seems that they have both going on at the same time, interestingly, people who
huh,
experience schizophrenia. Um,
interesting.
but but for the most case, we're either in forward motion or in
Mhm.
fight or flight. So I
Okay.
don't really call it fight or flight in the book, really, because
Mhm.
it's basically just flight. It's not really fight.
Yeah.
It's flight, So it's like our
Mhm.
reverse gear.
Mhm.
But our forward moving gear is what we want, what we like, or what we're driven towards because we're going to like it, the expectation sort of thing.
Mhm.
But as soon as something startles us, we
Mhm.
can flip straight into the reverse gear where we're running
Mhm.
away, and we're not running on dopamine anymore for the most part. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. And the way that you put that, the dopamine is the forward gear and glutamate would be the reverse gear, really does make me think about how, while in active addiction, a lot of the things that were driving me towards addiction were fear based. And so in my head, all I could picture is me like being in a chair while facing the thing and being in reverse, but it's still coming towards me. But with
Wow.
dopamine, it would be the opposite. It'd be I'm driving towards it, and so I know what to expect a little bit more, you know. And I think that
Mm.
that is kind of the perspective shift that I actually had while I was in therapy. That I don't want to be running away from the things that I'm going to have to face one way or another. And it really did,
Amazing.
yeah, it really did put a shift on my recovery because whenever I realized the things I was running from are going to be there anyways, the best way that
Yeah.
I can influence it is to actually acknowledge it and get to learn it and go from there. But if I'm running,
Yeah.
if I'm running, I'm the one being in under control. So,
That's right. That's right. You were able to turn that around,
mhm,
and stop running and face it head on,
mhm,
and be brave and take steps forward instead of steps away, which is
mhm,
extremely powerful. You took back control.
mhm.
So, did you find that on your own, or did someone guide you to that? Because someone guided me to that. I didn't find that on my own.
Oh, I had to be guided on that.
Mm.
While I was in therapy, it just kind of happened one day, and it was in a rehab. So I thankfully got therapy in rehab, and it turned out to be like I love therapy now, and I didn't think that I would like it at all, you know. But it was um, kind of more of an epiphany that I had while we were talking about something unrelated. And it just made me realize that everything that I've been running from is just a part of life. And
Mm.
I've, I get to choose what that part of life looks like a little bit more if I go towards it instead of have something else choose it for me.
Yeah,
So,
that's awesome. And that's growth mindset too. So
mm-hmm,
you actually empowered yourself. Instead of seeing stress as something to cower away from, you took it on as a challenge and you said, okay, my body's going to react, but I'm going to, find out how this will make me stronger instead of how it's going to victimize me.
mm-hmm. And it is definitely one of the harder things to do because I still work on it every day because there's definitely times where it's like oh, yeah, I could do that, but I don't need to because either I have time to do it or I decide to procrastinate because of fear of failure or fear of success. And
Mm,
it's something that I have to be mindful of, that even though I may face the same situation or emotion, it's going to come at me from a different angle and try to make me think that it's the same thing again. So,
yeah.
um, mm-hmm,
Me too. Every time I put something off or think I can't be bothered, I have to interject and I say to myself, I do hard things that I don't want to do so that I
mm-hmm,
have the ability to do what I want. You know, I
mm-hmm,
if I notice that I'm, not cowering, but like backing away or putting things off, I have to
mm-hmm,
remind myself, no, I'm somebody who chooses to do hard things now.
mm-hmm,
That's what got me out of that mess.
mm-hmm.
So I just do it now. I just go, all right, we're going to do it because it's going to grow the brain, make me stronger. Let's just go.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how a lot of our old selves like to stick on to the new self. You know, even if it wasn't something that was beneficial, it was like, oh, hey, I remember what it was like at this level and it was easier, so I kind of want to go back there. But it is.
Yeah, because we're always looking for ease.
Mm-hmm.
Because when in evolution, the effort that you expend to get something can be it could be the last effort you actually have. It could be the
Mm-hmm.
last energy in the tank to get that food.
Mm-hmm.
So energy was a commodity we couldn't really afford to lose. So it would be smarter for us to take the closer fruit while we had the option,
Mm-hmm.
because if we're walking, a mile to get the other fruit, it might not be there when we get there, and then we might collapse from exhaustion. So we always had to, like, weigh up energy expenditure. So it's just
Mm-hmm.
how the brain is wired. So although
Mm-hmm.
it's like much easier and nicer to just do easy stuff,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't really pay off in energy and in dopamine. So
Mm-hmm.
we just have to remember that. And once we know that it's everything we do that's hard goes in our favor, it doesn't go against us.
Mm-hmm.
Work doesn't go against us. We get into this, mindset of, oh, I've got to work, poor me, you know. Um, and in some cases, obviously, people are overworked.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
but if we think about work as something that's damaging to us and it's going against us and it's going to cause us pain and suffering, instead of just reframing it like, this
Mm-hmm.
makes me stronger, this makes me grow, this gives me opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
then if we look at it like that, we're going towards it
Mm-hmm.
instead of always, backing away from hard work.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that would help out the mental health status for a whole bunch of people. Just reframing something simple as going to work every morning. So.
Yeah, it's really a privilege that we are able to earn money, that we
Mm-hmm.
are in a society where we can choose our own job in a lot of cases. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we can actually get money so we can buy food. Like, there
Yeah.
are so many people in the world who don't have the access for employment, they can't buy food,
Mm-hmm.
they're on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So, really, we have a lot to be grateful for.
Yeah, and it is something that it does sometimes take falling on your butt really hard to figure out what it is that you actually do have while you still have it. Um,
Yeah. That's
but
that age old thing. Like, you don't really, you're not grateful until you've lost it, or however the
mhm.
saying goes, something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
But
you
at
don't
least the
at
yeah,
least
at least we're now grateful for it.
yeah, yeah. And that's the thing, is that at least we're grateful for it now, and it teaches me that we can be grateful for the things that we get later on in life too. So, um,
Yeah.
it's one of those lessons that it kind of gives to myself in the future if I remember it. But that's the hard part, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
But so now if I'm in a low mood, I just go,
mhm,
just do something hard, then have a reward, then do something hard and then have a reward. And I slowly dig myself out of it that way, bit
mhm.
by bit.
That's awesome, and I think that that is something that we could definitely expand upon too. So, I do want to ask you real quick. We are right near the end of this episode. Do you think that we could see you on the show in the future, say in a couple
Yeah, I'd
months or
love
so?
to.
Okay.
Love to come back.
Sweet. Because there's a lot more to dive into with dopamine and GABA, I'm sure, because there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can do with or without it. Well, not really without it. We can't do anything without it, right?
Can't do much without it, really. No. It just
um,
has to be in balance. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So, real quick, what shout outs do you have for yourself?
So you can find my book, Dopamine Mountain, online at
Okay.
dopaminemountain.com. That's it there. It's quite a thick book, but a lot of it is references at the back. So don't be put off by how thick it is.
Okay.
And on Instagram and Facebook, also Dopamine Mountain.
Okay, sweet. So everyone out there, definitely check all that out because it is something we want to improve on, right? Our dopamine and our GABA, making everything a little bit better. So, with that being said, let's see, the 988 number is getting shut off, so we can't really talk about that anymore. Oh wait,
Is that the helplines?
the suicide helpline, it's getting turned off.
Right.
Um, let's see, I need Canada suicide prevention
We're
number.
going to have to help each other. We're
Mm-hmm.
going to have to help each other. If you
Mm-hmm.
need, just call somebody and
Mm-hmm.
tell people to be ready for a call, because we're going to have to do it ourselves. You know,
Yeah.
we're going to have to answer those calls for people and talk to
Mm-hmm.
people.
Yeah.
And I think some people use AI for this kind of thing as well,
Mm-hmm.
which is good. You know,
Yeah.
at least it's something. But
Mm-hmm.
we're going to have to reach out to our people in need.
Yeah. And unfortunately, there's a few different numbers that I pulled up and not the one that is toll free. But I do agree that we do have to sit there and be ready for each other, especially with everything coming around. So, um, with that being said, I think it's good to say we've reached the end of this episode. So, with that being said, why did I say that twice?
Well,
um,
with that being said, for a third time.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to Retrieving Sanity on WDJY 99.1 FM. And this has been Andy West, author of Dopamine Mountain. And be sure to check it out and go to retrievingsanity.com. Check out the guest page to find her profile and all the links there. So, Andy, thank you again for being on the show. And I look forward to speaking with you in the future.
Thank you, Keegan.
Of course. And